Hi there, everybody. Okay, so I think I always wondered to myself, what do I tell people? I can't tell them about managing property because that's what they do far better than me. So what does one talk about? And I think of a lot of the questions I get these days from no matter where I go. When I speak to estate agents, property brokers, company CEOs, whatever, it's all the same thing. It's about the sort of bigger picture, the longer term economic picture now. Interest rate hiking and these type of small things are important, but Blue Bulls getting back to the top of world rugby, that's important. But the big deal is what is South Africa, the longer term, the sort of the bigger picture, the super cycle I talk about, and how it affects property specifically. And that's sort of what I'm going to focus on today, mostly in my 45 or so minutes that I have to focus on it. And to tell you that when people say to me, and they always want good news as well. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure how much good news there is in the pipeline at the moment. But the one bit of good news I'm going to tell you is that the world is far less predictable than what most people think. And that's the good news about it. And what it means is that we tend to get thinking, especially if you're a chartered accountant. I always mock the chartered accountants. If there are any in the room, don't take too much offense. They and many people too seem to think in straight lines, and that's the flaw. The world doesn't work in straight lines; it works in cycles. Some of them particularly long. But we get into this. We got to the sort of anchoring bias. We've got all these cognitive biases in us, and so you give your corporate bosses 20% sales growth for a couple of years or whatever, and that's it. That's how it's going to grow forever. And the budgets just go up, and you've just got to carry on growing like this for forever and ever and ever and ever. It's sort of, like a Steinhoff share or something like that once upon a time. And then costs always have to go down and down and down and down, and they're never going to stop either, not thinking that somewhere you get to zero. So that's how we tend to think in straight lines, and we tend to miss the turning points. I've missed a few big ones myself in my lifetime, and I'll tell you about them now. So I think this is quite important. The super cycle, we're in a super cycle downturn now, and I'll show you a few graphs shortly. The question is, does it ever turn? And I'm going to sort of put to you that at some point it probably or possibly does turn. I missed the last turning point spectacularly in the 1980s, 1990s, and I hope not to miss the next turning point. Okay, just a couple of, hope you can all see these. My other graphs are going to be bigger than this. This one's a bit small. But on the right-hand side, so basically, the moment the economists talk about interest rates, I don't talk so much about interest rates, but there's the left-hand graph. Interest rates, inflation has surged to 7.8 something percent, and prime rates surged to 9.75%. The residential property demand is slowing down. Buying demand, and in the near term, probably new development demand will slow down too. That's the short-term cycle. That's great. But more troublesome to us is on the right-hand graph if you look at the longer-term economic growth rate, where it's not so much about interest rates anymore. You'll see, if you look at the left graph briefly, that the interest rate cycles have been lower and lower and lower. 15.5 was the global financial crisis peak. Before that, the previous cycle peak was 17% prime. Lower and lower and lower, interest rates have become supposedly less troublesome, and at 9.75 prime now, we shouldn't really be having a big issue, but we are starting to have a bit of an issue because there's all these structural constraints setting in, and I don't have to mention too much of them. Eskom, electricity supply, transport sector, parts of it creaking under the pressure, such as harbours, and the list goes on. Often the sort of more state-controlled part of the economy, and I'll talk a bit about that now. So we've got this sort of funny situation in the country. We've got some world-class sectors and some world-worst sectors. It's a very strange, very unbalanced sort of growth rate, and the world-worst sectors often holding the good ones back. And one has to sort of balance that out if you want to get to stronger economic growth. And interestingly enough, and I was just picking up on the previous conversation of transformation, well, it's difficult to transform when you don't, or you're not growing the pie. You can change the players within that small pie, But you can't get more players in that easily if your size of your economic pie is not growing substantially, something China realized a few decades ago and put in place policies to grow like crazy and bring a few 100 million more people into their economy. Okay, but enough of China. So we've stagnated, if you look at the right-hand graph, since about 2000, well, broadly speaking, since before the global financial crisis. We had a little mini recovery after it. But say since 2012 or so, the last decade, broad economic growth has just been stagnating to where we now are more or less a zero growth economy. Yes, we bounced back after an abnormal decline in the lockdowns, but more or less now we're structurally a 0.1% growth economy, not really going places, not bringing substantially more people into this economy. And with it, if you look at the FNB Real House Price Index, this is to the first correction, the first post-GFC correction was that it's an index form, so don't worry about the numbers. It's in real terms, adjusted for inflation to get, what are house prices doing, in really. And you saw a sharp correction there in the global financial crisis, or just after it, over here. Then you saw some sort of slight mini recovery, and since about 2016, there's been this broad decline again, picking up a little bit of speed more recently as interest rates rise and so on. Okay, so we're in correction. We're in a long-term correction phase in the residential property market, commercial too, for that matter. Often not seen because it's sort of low price inflation or capital growth, which doesn't keep up with inflation. So people think they're growing, but they're not really growing. It's going backwards. That's where we are. This is our macroeconomic forecast. Just briefly, all I want to show you here is that after some recovery in 2021 out of the GFC, out of the lockdown contraction in 2020, we sort of forecast by first rand to settle back into the ones and twos through the forecast period. Nothing too much exciting happening. I think even with these sort of 1.9, 1.8% economic growth rates, we'll be lucky if we get that, given what we're seeing with the state of the electricity sector, for instance. Modern economies don't run easily without electricity. Okay, and we saw a little bit of a surge. This is the FNB Estate Agent Survey Market Activity Indicator, how estate agents see home buying activity. We saw a big surge out of lockdown. Interest rates were cut in 2020, so this demand indicator got quite strong, but has been slowing ever since as we go back into our stagnant economic growth and as interest rates rise and all that 2020 stimulus wears off. Year on year, sorry, I don't know where to point, but anyway, sort of year on year, point behind me here, we've gone into negative territory. In other words, activity levels have been declining according to estate agents. So how did we get here? That's the question. I mean, we get to this situation where we just can't seem to grow. Okay, there's just nothing, not much we can do. And how did it, a number of years ago, we were growing like the clappers before the global financial crisis, and we all thought we were really cool, 5% plus economic growth, housing market bubble, golf estates being built all over the place, and all this nice stuff, okay? What went wrong? Well, to a certain extent, I'm afraid we were fooling ourselves during that time, but I'll get to that shortly. This is the economic growth supercycle. This is 5-year annual average economic growth rates, just to cut out all the noise. And you can see that through the 70s and 80s and 90s, we had a long, broad stagnation as well, down to just about zero in 1990 to 94. Got so bad, that's where the Sharks won their first Currie Cup. It was dark days. Really was bad. But it started off with global factors. Oil price shocks sound familiar. 1973, 74, 80, Cold War, splitting the world in two. That sort of, there's often protectionist measures and supply chains can't sort of globalize across the world and be more efficient. Relatively high inflation and so on, sort of stagflationary type environment brewing, and that's what hit us in the 1980s. For South Africa, it got worse because of the boycotts and economic sanctions against the previous government, okay? We were an unacceptable sort of, had an unacceptable system for much of the rest of the world. So that's all the boycotts and sanctions, chickens came home to roost, and we just got worse and worse and worse through the 1980s. Now, what did this bring about? Now, we talk about policy and politics often influencing the economy, but we don't talk about the economy influencing politics. And as things got worse, so what happens is people get angrier. There's a lack of economic opportunity, poverty levels rising, and slowly but surely they turn against the government. Okay? Well, much of the population in that era was already against the government, but the increasing anger levels made it easier for the opponents to that government to mobilize them against that government. And even in the white electorate, it was a white sort of minority system, or not, well, tricameral, whatever you call it, but the white population's parliament being the dominant one. And even there, a portion of the white population were also starting to feel the economic effects. And so every election that went by in the white that minority system, the percentage of the popular vote of the ruling party was on the decline. Until one day in October 1989, and I believe that was the catalyst for radical policy change. The ruling party, the National Party's popular vote in the last white election got to 48.2%. And I believe when you get to below 50%, you start to panic as a ruling party. You start to become a little bit more concerned, however you want to put it. And that was October 1989, the last white election. And de Klerk probably woke up the next morning, called Pik Botha, said, "Kom loer gou hier in my kantoor en hier's kak." Something like that. Okay. And they realized that probably if they carried on like they were for another 5 years and just did nothing, just carried on like they were probably going to lose the next white election. They were probably going to lose it. And so it was time for a radical policy change. What would that policy change be? Well, he did have options. I mean, he could turn back right and swallow up the Conservative Party, the right wing, the one that was eating him from the right. There was the Democratic Party from the left and the Conservative Party from the right, or he could go and try and swallow up the Democratic Party, make white minority rule look a bit more palatable, or there was a third alternative: let's go and cut a deal with that party we've always called the enemy of the state and banned and exiled and put in prison and so on. That's the route he chose. I missed that totally. I missed it, and that was what led to the sort of super cycle turn. Okay, that announcement on that day of the end of minority rule, 2nd of February 1990. That was the big announcement. The big dips in the super cycle increased the political opposition to the ruling party, whoever they may be, as the anger levels mount. At the poll, their percentage starts dipping. Last year in the local government election, for the first time since 1989, the ruling party's national percentage was below 50% again. Okay? And that's where the time for more radical policy change comes about. It can be good policy change, as I think it was there. That was probably the best route he could follow. It can be bad populist type policy change, which is disastrous from an economic point of view. But it's time to change, because you sit there and you realize your support base is being eaten up. It's time to do something. Okay. The key characteristics of change is that we rarely anticipate it, the turning point, because we've got this anchoring bias in our heads. We always take the recent past and extrapolate it into the future, just like a bunch of accountants, yes. Okay? So, sorry guys. I do love them, but yeah, anyway. But that's what human beings do. And I thought in the late 1980s that you just saw this unrest situation mounting, Cold War still, I didn't see the Berlin Wall coming down either in 1989. Cold War affecting us badly in this part of the world, destabilizing this part of the continent. And I just didn't really think at some, and the rhetoric from politicians doesn't tell you much either, because they deny a lot of things right up until the bitter end. Okay? So if we listen to the noise around us of what leaders say and neglect the data and facts, we also we miss the potential turning point. Okay? And we don't look either at what leaders' incentives and motivations are. Okay? De Klerk had a political career to try and salvage, and so did his nationalist government. There's also a personal aspect too. It's not sinister. They're just like career bankers or career property people or career anybody else. There's a lot of self-interest involved here as well. And you need to try and understand that and not be like a bunch of economists. Our weak point is that we often think that everybody should operate in the best interests of the economy. That's not always the case either. There's personal agendas and interests too. Okay. What we also don't understand is that when change gets announced, and that's what this one taught me, de Klerk's announcement taught me, is that you need strong and unified leadership to get you through a very turbulent period often, because when you announce big changes, you're threatening to marginalize certain interest groups that benefited from the old, whatever the old setup was. And they will try and sabotage that change. They will often, because they don't see benefits for themselves in the future. And so you had the far right and the far left committing all sorts of acts of, let's call it terror or whatever it was, to try and sabotage that process between 1990 and 94. And the two main groupings obviously were the sort of nationalist government and the ANC, who had very strong leaders at the top who had control over their groups, and that kept a lid on it, that kept the process going. It's important that you have that. Okay. What are we doing here? Change. There we go. Right. Okay, so then we went into the post-1994 super cycle upswing, and it temporarily masked a lot of our shortcomings as an economy. I'm trying to get this thing to... There we go. Now, why did it mask that? It was because we had some easy stimulus levers to pull. Ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. Okay? Stimulus lever one. There were three that I'm going to mention here. Stimulus lever one, we got to a political solution. That was tough to get to. But once we got there, 94 came. Boycotts and sanctions across the rest of the world ended with a stroke of a pen, literally. And we could normalize trade with the rest of the world. Boom. The benefits of that have been felt. That took our economic growth up, our exports up, and our economic growth up to the next level. Okay. Stimulus lever two, we had extremely high interest rates and overhang from high inflation in the 1980s, 25.5% prime as in 1998, it's that little spike. That's the, okay, you can just see the quarterly average 23.8, but for a little short while it was 25.5, okay? We could move to inflation targeting, and CPI inflation had come down from the 80s into single-digit figures, long story as to why. And we put in place this inflation target, realized we didn't need those astronomical high interest rates anymore, had this massive reduction in interest rates, sort of a two-stage reduction, unleashed a massive consumer spending boom and a massive housing boom and all the stuff that came with it. Not because we were growing because we were doing the right structural changes or anything, but because in the 90s, because of high interest rates, the debt to disposable income ratio of households was very low. In other words, a much lower level of indebtedness. And they could crazily grow their credit-driven spending over here for a long while before they got into trouble because they'd been holding back because of the high interest rates. So there was this sort of upward adjustment in household indebtedness, well, and commercial sector indebtedness as well. So we could fuel this at one stage 5% plus economic growth purely because we could accelerate this borrowing growth and live off debt. Now, that's great. I mean, you know, in your personal situation too, you can borrow and spend for quite some time and look quite successful because you drive a nice car and host big parties in your mansion. But ultimately, you get to a level of debt where you have to slow down, otherwise there's trouble. That's very, very, very simple stuff. So that was stimulus lever two, but now we're a highly indebted corporate sector and household sector. And so we don't really... We can't really cut interest rates to the bone. Interest rates are relatively low these days anyway, and fuel this borrowing growth and fuel 5% economic growth. That's just unrealistic. So stimulus lever two has been pulled, ka-ching, 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 pretty much done. And nowadays when you cut interest rates, most of the economy just breathes a sigh of relief. They don't go out to spend like crazy like they used to. Okay, we used to say when the going gets tough, the tough go shopping, but that's not the case anymore. But there was last throw of the dice. Stimulus lever three. Government had relatively low debt. A debt to GDP ratio down at like 20% back in 2008. They brought it down because of this very strong revenue growth in a very strong growth period. Government could run bigger deficits, crank up this debt to GDP ratio for quite a number of years, and try and keep the growth party going. That's sort of like, I compare it to those of you who have been to varsity, and some of you might have drank a little bit too heavily, and next morning you have a bit of a babbelas, as they say in Afrikaans. You wake up and the theory was you start drinking again to get rid of the hangover, okay? That's this sort of thing, trying to fuel growth all the time with more and more debt. Eventually you've got to take the pain, you've got to stop borrowing, and you've got to come down to, and take your medicine and get rid of your hangover. So that's what we did. That was the last throw of the dice, stimulus lever 3. And now all sectors of the economy have got relatively high debt levels. Incidentally, living off debt and low interest rates and big stimulus packages is not a South African unique thing. The whole world seems to have been doing it. The US, China, the whole lot. Now there's this massive pile of debt all over the world, and chickens in some countries are already coming home to roost. Okay, I think Sri Lanka being the most recent one. Good, so that's it. So we've run out of easy stuff to do, just drive up the debt and keep growth going. And now they've all been pulled, and now it's the hard road to structural reform. Now we don't grow. Now we're just not growing easily at all. And the thing is now, so what should structural reform entail? And are there signs of shift towards positive structural reform? Because if they're not, then we're not going to grow in the long term. And then, as I say, all these things like about bringing, as I say, I was just listening to the previous conversation. You want to be a more inclusive economy. Yes, of course, we do want to be a more inclusive economy. You won't get it right easily if you don't grow. There's too few people. This economy is too small. We know that because of the poverty levels. We know that. It needs to be bigger. Right. So what is the current reality for the residential property market, at least till the super cycle at some point turns? Well, that's the state of general government economic infrastructure investment. It was at 7.5% of GDP back in 1976. Then the political situation deteriorated. Then defense budgets, growth stagnated, rates bills and tax bills and all sorts of things stagnated. Defense budgets took over national government's a big part of its budget. Infrastructure investment went south. It never really recovered. So we're living more and more nowadays off 60s infrastructure and early 70s infrastructure from those big fixed investment booms, and there's not enough coming in to replace it and keep the economy expanding. So that's the infrastructure investment remains very, 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 very low, and a lot of infrastructure is getting tired. In the government sector, the parastatal sector, capital, what do they call it? Human capital investment has also been lacking, not just physical capital, the skills base, the management base, and so on. And now a lot of those institutions are running out of momentum and collapsing literally. PRASA, for instance, SAA has pretty much already, and so on. So the human capital investment has been as poor in the state sector as has been infrastructure investment. What does that mean for housing? Well, since the 1970s, it's meant more and more, or 1980s, say, for instance, it's sectional title and clusters and estates and things where you take charge of your own infrastructure. That's why a lot of this stuff has evolved, because of I can remember as a small kid in the 70s, councils, at least in white areas, let's add that, would roll out streets and plots, and you'd just go and buy your stand from the municipality. That doesn't happen anymore. There's none of that. I've never seen that infrastructure provided by councils anywhere anymore, really. Now it's a case of the developer takes over and provides the whole bang shoot. And then it's privately owned and privately managed and privately run, and that's probably why many of you sit here today. So that's the situation for the foreseeable future in an era of ongoing low infrastructure investment all round, is that the private sector has to pretty much do it for itself. We're in an era where the private sector is replacing a lot of government over time. It's replaced the railway sector with road transport. It's done, and the great thing about South Africa when it comes to this continent sort of standards is we've got this really vibrant private sector. And that's what's really kept us going, is its ability to replace, and now starting to replace the electricity parastatal as well in greater proportions. Okay, a vibrant private sector has really done well for us. Okay, and of course the various taxation rates go up. Municipal rates and tariffs as a percent. This is just an index form, so don't worry about the numbers, but it's the trend since 2008. Electricity, we know the story. I don't need to. CPI, municipal rates, utilities, tariffs, per capita disposable income, as a ratio of per capita disposable income, all taking a bigger share of the wallet of the household sector. So we've got to rationalize. We've got, higher costs involved with residential property. Got to have smaller and more cost-effective residential properties to try and offset the various areas of the state that increase your operating costs on property. And it's not only the operating cost-related stuff. The effective personal tax rate, in other words, personal tax as a percentage of disposable income, takes a greater and greater portion out of the household income. It bottomed at 9.4% of household sector income in 2004. It was 14.2% in 2020. Came back a little bit because the economy tanked in 2020 and then grew significantly, so it sort of came back, but I don't think that's a sign of a start of a downward trend in the effective tax rates on households. So the household sector more and more constrained all the time. And so I guess this is what you should expect from the long-term trend: densification, economic infrastructure, lack of urban infrastructure investment. You've got to use more land more efficiently. You've got to contain the costs. You've got to go for smaller sized units and so on. And you've got to build your own sort of infrastructure related to housing. And so if you look at Stats SA's building plans passed, what's the biggest? There's dwelling houses greater than 80 square meters. Dwelling houses, basically freestanding houses. Dwelling houses less than 80 square meters, freestanding houses, in other words. And then flats and townhouses, and no prizes for guessing that once upon a time, back in the late 90s, 11% of plans passed were flats and townhouses. That's about 48% as we speak now. That's the broad long-term trend. They take over a bigger and bigger part of the development market for residential property. And I guess it's more of the same for the foreseeable future until we come to some, at least, situation where maybe one day we have a sort of a bigger and a better infrastructure in sort of investment rate. Even then, that's difficult to see because a lot of the urban land has just run out. You can't just carry on sprawling forever. Okay, so the question now, that's the situation, is can it turn for the better? And that's what everybody asks me all the time. And that's what I'm going to talk about. I do believe it can. And I do believe we've seen the ingredients. We've seen the ingredients for improvement. And I've alluded to it now, a vibrant private sector. There's some countries that are not developed enough, so if government were to open something up to the private sector, they wouldn't come because they're just not there. It's just not developed enough. South Africa is a services-dominated economy. We're not a mining-dominated economy. We haven't been for decades. We're a services-dominated economy. We're a sophisticated economy. And when the private sector is allowed to do something, someone comes and does it. Okay, normally. So that's important. I think what we've also seen is, I've also said that there's certain sectors that are world-class. Now, you don't have to like us, but the financial sector is rated as one of them by global competitiveness monitors regularly. Okay, there's others too. I mean, our retail sector looks pretty good as well. Our property sector looks pretty good as well. Okay, the key, I believe, is getting the split right between government and the private sector. And the split is government should be regulatory and do it well, and the private sector should deliver the goods. Okay, where government delivers the goods, that's where we're starting to run into problems. There's various reasons for that, but I think it's got a lot to do with a set of incentives. I don't believe government people are inherently inferior or anything like that to the private sector. I don't buy that. I don't buy all these things. It's about the set of incentives. And even in developed countries where the government sector runs relatively well compared to what we're seeing at the moment, it's still, there's questions about, why are they not performing as well as our private sector? Well, it's about getting to a situation where you've got well-regulated competition, because I believe well-regulated competition, not free markets, well-regulated competition, you get the right competition sort of levels, it drives human performance up. That's I believe. It's about the structure of industries. And we, in this country, same labor laws, same everything, where you got this financial sector that is one of the better ones in the world. Why? Not because we're superior human beings or anything like that. No, not at all. It's because for whatever the historical reasons are, this country's developed a well-regulated, actually highly regulated for that matter, competitive model, which has served us relatively well. Not perfectly, but well. Okay? If you look at sporting bodies, FIFA, IRB, ICC, none of them play the sports that they regulate. They only regulate. And the clubs owned by whoever, they are the play that they deliver. So I think if you can get to that, if you can look at the microeconomics of industries, a competitive electricity model, which I believe is coming, suddenly you can get to a situation where you can actually improve some of those underperforming sectors quite quickly, relatively quickly, and you can turn the corner. And do I believe we're on the way to that? I actually do. And I think the Eskom crisis is a key turning point. Every single voter in the country knows about the Eskom crisis, I think, and feels it. And I think that's not where government wants to be, with support already below 50% in the local government election and into a messy era of coalition politics. It's time for more significant policy change. And I think that, and it's not, you mustn't look at what leaders necessarily say they want. They don't always get what they want. Economic forces tell them what they want, just like the previous government eventually made its changes on the 2nd of February 1999 because of economic forces telling them what was going to happen to them too. And this is what's happening now. So I think we're almost, we're getting to a stage where the private sector is already in a process for decades now of replacing a lot of the state-owned enterprises. It has replaced rail to a large extent. It's replacing electricity now. The challenge is obviously to make it a well-regulated setup, because free markets can be absolutely chaotic and shambolic and disastrous, and eventually some warlord can take it over and regulate it for you if you don't regulate it properly. But I think that's where we're going. It's a grudging acceptance perhaps by the authorities at this stage, but a more significant move towards private sector replacement. And I think when that happens, South Africa will start to see that a lot of other sectors can also perform very well. And you can deliver electricity very well, just like you deliver financial services or retail for that matter. When I walk into a Woolies, it's not much different from a Marks and Spencer's in London. And you can be fairly world class, and those underperforming sectors can improve quite quickly. So that's where I think we are. And I do believe the turning point, but it's important not to get too carried away with the pace. That's not my boss. I say these things to him, and he gets all excited, and then tomorrow morning he turns around and says to me, "It hasn't happened yet." And it's a process. The nationalist government, beginning of its end, was probably about 1976, and 18 years later they left power. Okay. It's long time frames, and I think that's quite important. In the meantime, we look for councils that I've got to finish off quickly now, I'm over my time, but we look for councils that in areas that work, that increase our quality of life and ability to operate as individuals. I think it's important for the property sector to move with that, and it is moving with that, I believe. This is card spend of FNB. I just took 2 years, 2020, 21. Net inflow of what we estimate to be semigrants, people migrating. No prizes for guessing that the Western Cape, has a big, strong inflow. Gauteng, a big, strong outflow, along with some of the other smaller provinces. The semigration is reshaping South Africa's where we live, where the purchasing power is, where the economic performance is. I think the Western Cape has entered a period of sort of like a golden era of economic growth and property development. Recent building statistics, building plans passed in the Western Cape growing by something near to 50%, Gauteng in decline, and the Western Cape looking like it might have a bigger development market this year than Gauteng, which has never happened before. So those are trends for the property sector to take notice of. They're getting quite big now as we all look for places that work and try and move away from some of the smaller provinces where places that don't work. Competition between councils coming to a theatre near you. Okay, important. So I've had to rush these last few slides, but don't think in straight lines. We're very poor at foreseeing turning points. I never saw the last one coming in 1990. I have to say, I was a youngster, and I just saw it get the unrest situation deteriorating, and a stubborn guy at the top refusing to yield. He did ultimately, or his successor moved things. Economic decision makers will act in self-interest, and self-interest changes over time. Once upon a time, I might have been comfy as a leader with 67% majority. When it gets down to 40-something, maybe I'm not so comfy anymore, and things have to, and I accept that things have to change. But few of us saw the last super cycle turning point. We went into a boom period after that. Few of us saw what it would bring, even a housing bubble to boot. So that's about all I've got time for. Thanks very much.